Hey, welcome back to BarryTsGarage. We have a great episode we're putting together here, and we're starting off in Alan Travis's personal museum. And you could tell by the background here, it's about small, early racing. These are race cars behind me. This is more than just knowledge out of a book. Alan has the equipment, the cars, the parts, and the knowledge, and the passion to show us about early car racing in both America and in Europe. So stay tuned, here we go. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning, Barry.
Give us the background to kind of how racing started both in the North America and in Europe.
All right. Well, in America, racing pretty much started as grudge matches between one manufacturer and another, maybe one or two or three cars in an event, and the event would be staged from maybe a bar or tavern, and they would race from one town to another town, these two 20 horsepower things. Not really a race, didn't really solve much, but egos. But in America, we didn't have any cars really from 1900 to 1903, say. So we didn't have any cars that could race, actually race.
Right.
So they devised a scheme of reliability runs. So they would say, okay, you need to average 20 miles an hour, and we're going to kind of weigh your car before the event and weigh your car after the event. And however much it weighed, i.e. what pieces fell off, what pieces broke, you couldn't change this and that and the other. They were called reliability runs.
Okay.
So again, they didn't weigh them, but they,
Right.
You started with this car, 40 miles later, did you end up with the same car? So they weren't going for speed because they didn't really have any speed.
Sure.
No suspension systems, and all the motors were different. Some of the motors were engines, some were motors, some were electric, some were steam, some were coal, some were gasoline powered. They were all different kinds of things. So there was no standard whatsoever.
It's kind of anything goes, I guess.
Right. But in Europe, they had more of a automotive base. Europe was 5 to 7 years ahead of America for automobiles. So they had the James Gordon Bennett races, and that were raced town to town to town and repeated town to town to town and repeated. And they did that because they had tried things like the Paris-Madrid race, and they killed, I've heard as many as 100 people. I've heard as little as 40 people in a race where they raced from one town, Paris, a big town, to Madrid, a 3-day race. They called it off after the first day because people couldn't figure out how to steer cars, how to brake cars on corners, how to go over bumps and jumps and that kind of stuff, how to navigate towns and bridges and all of that kind of stuff. So they figured out that kind of racing was out. That wasn't going to happen anymore. So then a guy, an American, came around, James Gordon Bennett. He owned the New York Herald newspaper. He decided to have some sort of a loose type system of rules from 1901 to 1905, where normal cars raced to village number one. When they got to village number one, they had somebody escort the car through the mile-long village. Then after they got to the end of the village, they started the time again, and they raced to the next village. And they added 4 or 5 villages to that circuit. And then they did 5 or 6 laps. And that was the first time they really had some sort of a organized event, but those weren't racing cars. Those were the different manufacturers' vehicles. Those were touring cars, those were roadsters, those were all kinds of little things, and they would race back and forth. And by the end of that series, they started with 1 and 2 cylinder cars. They ended up with 6-cylinder cars, 4 big 4-cylinder cars, and they got to the point where they could go 60 or 70 miles an hour.
Wow.
And this is evidenced by these postcards here. These postcards here are all from the James Gordon Bennett race series. Initially, the cars were little buggy cars, like in that triptych up there. And by the time of 1905 came around, they were big, powerful cars that could go 60 or 70 mile an hour. Still didn't have braking systems or suspension systems and control systems, but they really developed through motor size and size of cars to make things at least seem really fast. But then that also started killing people too, and they were so different as far as all the different cars. So in 1906, 1907, and 1908, they come up with the first Formula One racing series. And Formula One meant single cylinder, even though they got from one cylinder to 6 cylinders from 1901 to 1905. They wanted to boil the automotive racing down to the core principles of racing. So they made everybody do the same formula, i.e. a 5-inch bore. You could do whatever you wanted on the stroke. You could have a certain amount of weight, all that kind of stuff. So then the cars were made to suit, were made to race. So all the cars looked the same starting in 1905. And those racing cars were basically all small, and those are called Voiturettes.
Was this in America or Europe?
Europe only.
Okay.
We had no Voiturettes in America. And the first year they did that, they were already up to that 60 mile an hour speed range, top speed. They were doing the same speeds with the single cylinder motors with all the refinements as they learned, as the bigger motors were. And that's where they finally decided, or they finally created a system to advance automotive.
Okay, so there's a little bit of a juxtaposition here, even with what we would, on one hand, call restrictions, because within the formula,
Yes.
seems very restrictive.
Yes, it is.
But it also seemed to give them really a standardized launch pad to develop very specific things for racing.
Aerodynamics came out of that.
Okay.
Different fuels came out of that. Different positions of the motor and the transmissions came out of that. All the suspension systems came out of that. That's when things really started to develop. And Europe, basically from 1905 through today, always have gone to smaller motors, like the Formula One racing cars of today, 125 years later. They're probably about the same size motor. I think they're a couple liters is all they are nowadays, which is a similar size to what they were 125 years ago.
Wow.
But they developed everything else, all their wings and all of the other kind of things.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess, so over periods of time, different parts of development, you can see it happening.
Yeah.
Fascinating to me that a one-cylinder engine was quickly going the same speed as these big brutes that were a year or two before.
Yeah. So once you have a limitation, then your mind starts getting excited because, okay, I have this has to stay the same. What can I do in this corner of the car and that part of the car and this part of the car?
Right.
And then things started to develop. Instead of just saying, let's just put a bigger motor on it. Right. A train had a motor that was 10 foot long. Well, it can't turn corners, a train.
Right.
It can't stop, a train.
Right.
Yeah, it's got a motor that's...
You have some physical examples to show the difference in the development of racing.
Yep.
So maybe we should go to the next room and have a look at that. All right, Alan, it's always a pleasure to come to see your collection here. It looks so beautiful. But in this case, we are going to focus on suspension development. And if you don't mind, can you tell us about these race cars here along this side here? And let's just talk about the different suspensions.
This is not a race car, but this is a 1904 Mitchell. This is what would have been used in the reliability runs in America. Could have been used, if it wasn't, but could have been used in the James Gordon Bennett races in Europe from 1901 to 1905. It's just a production car. It's based on a buckboard wagon. It's made by Mitchell, which is a wagon company. It's got typical wagon suspension, and we'll cover that in more depth.
Okay.
This is built for the Formula One racing series in 1906, 7, and 8. This is a 1906 Sizaire. Very, very highly refined suspension, which we'll get into that. Very compliant. It also won this model, won the Targa Floria in 1907. So that's basically like a Baja 1000 type event.
Okay.
This is a 1909 Delage Voiturette race car. It raced more on limited tracks, and a track might be a 3 mile or 5 mile, smooth road course.
Okay.
Voiturette still limited to about the same size motor. The Bugatti is also a Voiturette race car, intended to race only on-road conditions, road racing type things. It's kind of like the gold standard of suspension. gold standard of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of give you an idea. This is 1904 to 1913. All these are about 100 cubic inches.
Oh, okay.
So the motor size of all these, maybe one is a 1-cylinder, one's a 2-cylinder, and there's a couple 4-cylinders, but they've all kind of standardized around about 100 cubic inches.
Uh-huh. Okay.
The Mitchell is a 25-mile-an-hour car or 30-mile-an-hour car, and the Sizaire, the Delage, and the Bugatti are all 50, 60-mile-an-hour up cars.
Wow. Okay.
We're going to consider it similar to a 1915 Indianapolis type car. It's got an overhead valve, almost hemispherical combustion chamber V8 engine, nice suspension, goes at least 80, and maybe today with our refinement, maybe 100 miles an hour. Still not that big of a motor, still only about 200 cubic inches.
Yeah, wow.
The next car doesn't fit the group. It's a 1906, 1907 Renault. This is the same exact AI version, 15% smaller, I guess, that won the first Le Mans race. This will still go 90 miles an hour today, and it's 1906, 1907. Over 500 cubic inches of 4-cylinder motor.
This goes back to that thought of just brute strength,
Yep.
power, and yes, beautiful. Okay, well, it's nice to have that as a contrast of mentality, I think, because all these smaller vehicles were clearly, they're all about being quick and lithe and easy to go, whereas this was just power and strength.
But the cars that direction are all called voiturettes,
Uh-huh.
which means small car in French, and this is a voiture, which is a big car racer.
Very good.
So this has semi-elliptic springs on it,
Okay.
and it does have one of the first examples of a hydraulic shock absorbers on it. And those are original. So there's a piston that goes both directions, fore and aft.
Okay.
The piston goes fore and aft inside, and there's grease that gets pushed in that piston back and forth to kind of dampen the shock.
Interesting. So like a hydraulic shock, kind of a two-way shock.
It really is hydraulic shock. It was a thick oil, or grease material in there, and it did slow the rebound from the semi-elliptic spring.
Yeah.
So they were thinking about a shock absorber. They didn't care about weight on this car, so the shocks weigh 15 pounds each, but it kind of dampened it somewhat.
Right. Okay. Very good.
The next car, it's got semi-elliptic springs in the front, and a semi-elliptic spring means the spring is 1/2 of a full elliptical. This is a full elliptical.
Okay.
A semi-elliptical is one half of that. The full motion is that lower spring going back and forth. And this has got Hartford friction shocks on it. And that's a very small Hartford friction shock because this is a road racing car. It only has a couple inches of suspension travel, so it can take a very small shock like that.
All right. So by smaller, it has less leverage because it's a shorter arm.
These are small arms from here to here and there to there.
Yep.
That's a Truffault Hartford shock. Those were invented actually and patented in the 1800s, in the 1890s.
Really?
They were marketed in Europe and they were marketed in America. Hartford was what you kind of group the whole group together with, so that's a Hartford shock.
Okay.
That's got a couple friction discs that move back and forth, and by tightening the center, you add to that friction. And we'll talk about that more in depth in this video toward the end.
Okay, cool. And let me just see the back of, the suspension in the back of this car.
The rear suspension is quarter-elliptic, so it's 1/4 of a full elliptic. It's just one leg of it, and you control it by long arm Hartford shocks.
Yeah.
And those long arms control the action of that car. The Bugatti has semi-elliptic, and what they did to kind of dampen the travel on the front end, they wrapped their springs. And that wrapping apparently dampened the jounce enough that they didn't have to have shocks. That was their method to keep that spring a little less lively. So that worked. This was again the gold standard of suspensions for road racing. Bugatti was hard to beat.
Yeah.
You know, for their size of motors and their size of cars, they were very, very competitive cars.
Right.
Very, very famous brand. This is one of the earliest Bugattis in the world. 4-cylinder, high RPM, overhead valve, all ball bearing camshaft. Virtually everything in the car is aluminum, extremely lightweight, extremely nimble, fun, quick car.
Mm-hmm.
You can cruise it all day long at 50 miles an hour today.
Yeah, it sounds like what we would call, in relative terms, a supercar today was probably similar to that in its time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And these weren't imported to America at all in the teens.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this was made 1 year after the Titanic was made.
Wow.
And just a wonderful car.
Yeah.
The next suspension, this is a 1909 Delage Voiturette. It has semi-elliptic. It doesn't have springs on it, but this was meant for they went on a 20-mile lap maximum on smoothness.
Okay.
And then they didn't have any village to stop in the Voiturette racing that this was involved in. So they could find a smooth enough course. So it doesn't have shocks. But on this one, because it's a Voiturette, which is a small car, they did something to the rear which is different. They added dumb iron to the spring. So it's got a semi-elliptic spring in the rear. But since it's a small car, that semi-elliptic spring would only be this long if the back of the car stopped at the back of the car. But the back of the car in this case has got dumb iron that's 1.5 feet longer, extending out the rear of the car, which makes the semi-elliptic spring in the rear much longer, so it has much more compliant long travel. And I'll show you that.
Yeah, let's have a look at that. That's an interesting trick.
So there's the dumb iron sticking out the rear of the car.
Right. It just feels like it's an extension of the body frame, maybe, is the way to think of it.
Right. So it's still a small car, but by having that, it gave more travel to the semi-elliptic spring.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. See if we can see right past the wheel. See those springs. Yeah, it makes them quite long.
So this doesn't have much travel, and it's still pretty harsh riding. But for road racing on dirt roads, and it wasn't an asphalt road, of course, but it was smooth enough and would handle well enough. So that's what they did, and this is 1909.
Right.
Okay, let's go back to the origin now.
Okay.
Okay, this is not a race car, but this is going to be in our comparison. So this car was the standard for at least the earliest cars. The earliest cars were copied from buckboard wagons because that's the technology they had. So a buckboard wagon has a full elliptical spring. So it goes back and forth like this. If you take the spring off the car, it's the same dimensions as basically on the car because these two top ones are pushing against these two bottom springs, and that's the full elliptic. That's a buggy spring. And then for a buggy, you know, when they were buggies, under the seat that you rode on, there was also 2 of these springs.
Okay.
So that a buckboard wagon has usually 2 sets of full elliptical spring sets. So there's tremendous jounce when you sit on or ride in a buckboard wagon car.
Okay.
So this is what needed to really be changed. So it doesn't matter what size engine this car has, it's not going to go very fast if it's rough at all. So that's why this is advertised to go 25 or 30, and I've never been more than 25 or 30 mile an hour, even though it has the same size, 100 cubic inches, as the next 3 or 4 cars in the line. So now we'll show you what a buckboard wagon suspension does, and you might think, for example, comparing these 2 cars, well, how could the suspension be so different from this car and this car being only about a year apart? Because this one's got buckboard wagon suspension, and this car's got racing suspension.
Okay.
All right, so I can describe it by a couple pushes on the car.
Okay.
So I'm going to push in this corner and watch what the car does.
Wow.
That's a buckboard wagon suspension.
Uh-huh.
So you can imagine any speed over 0, is bad.
Right? Yeah, there's a lot of wiggle jiggle going on there.
There's a huge amount. So you're never going to get this combination of suspension to go fast no matter what you do with the motor size.
Right.
So here's a car that's 1 year newer than this, maybe a year and a half newer, and this has got a very sophisticated suspension system. Both the same size motors, basically the same weight vehicles. Watch what this one does when I push on it.
Wow.
So if it's a rough road, which car would you like to ride in?
Yeah.
If you're going to ride in a race, which car would you not fall out of?
Right. Yeah, that's true. And they also didn't have seat belts and helmets and all those things. So what a difference, because just at a glance, you see two seats, some wood and brass, and, at a very cursory glance, they don't seem very different at all.
While we're talking about, let's take these two examples into the other room, and let's do an in-depth on the suspension systems to show the difference, what actually makes the difference between this car and this car.
Okay.
In suspension systems.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is basically a Circus, an original Circus sign put up for a Circus, and they're showing a car like the Buckboard wagon car, like the 04 Mitchell that we just pushed on the corner of and saw the jounce.
Right.
But even though it's basically this car, this Circus, which is like a Barnum and Bailey Circus company, they were about as big. They built a ramp that would drop a car down, and they said by their advertising the car would go a couple loop-de-loos and land again. Well, how possible is that? I don't even know if 1 mile an hour over a 1-inch bump is very good. But I have 8,500 books and magazines on the early automotive. So if I see something funny or something that's advertised, I try to back it up or not back it up by my early magazines and books.
Right.
So I found the date of this lithograph, and then I found a magazine that covered the same area, that same time frame, and that same Circus.
Okay.
So this is that same ramp setup, and this is a car like we just showed.
Yeah.
And there's the ramp. It doesn't show the other end of it, how high it goes up.
Right.
But it does show a landing ramp also. And the text on this article says, this car did this for the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night performances. It doesn't look like it's doing loop-de-loo, but it's going off a ramp, flying, it's probably 15 foot in the air, and landing on another ramp. I don't have the next issue of this magazine to see on Friday night if they did it also, but they did it 4 days.
Yeah.
So they were aware of suspension systems, or this person became very aware of suspension systems.
Very aware. That's some wild testing right there, if nothing else. That's crazy.
I'm sure glad you didn't ask me the next question. Alan, why don't we make this ramp set up and show the people at home?
Right.
We just don't have time.
No, that's right. Yeah, we're sorry, we're out of time.
Yeah.
Good.
The Truffault Hartford shock absorbers were patented in the 1800s, the late 1800s, 1890s. And then they came to use in 1904 in Europe. You could buy them for your car. They were $40 for, say, the rear for a small car, and $60 for a pair for the large car. And what people made at that period of time was a couple dollars a day.
Yeah.
So you worked 2 or 3 weeks to afford your shock absorbers. But that made the biggest difference on your automobile as you can possibly imagine, as you just saw by the jouncing and by the smoothness of the two cars that are only separated by 1 year.
Right.
I have thousands of early magazines. Here's a magazine from 1906. And I could have gotten a 1905 one out too, or maybe even some 1904s with the same ads. But here's a beautiful ad on that shock absorber that you just saw. Truffault was the designer. Hartford was the manufacturer for most of them, but they also licensed other countries to make their shocks too. So the shocks that we're going to slip off the Sizaire are French licensed Hartfords. And then this is an article showing how they operate with the arm. So that's another one, and that's a full article there next to it. So all of our cars that we have them on weigh less than the 1,500 pounds, and that's $40.
For the 4 pieces, so $10 each corner, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it is for 4 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is the 04 Mitchell and the 06 Sizaire front. So this is a buckboard wagon. So this is basically just as the same suspension exactly as what a wagon had. And this is a Mitchell car, and Mitchell made Mitchell Wagon Works. The day before they made this car, they literally made wagons.
Look at that.
So it's pretty easy to understand why they would have a wagon suspension on a wagon with a motor wagon.
Sure.
So this is, when you push this, you just have your buggy springs, just like they had on their wagon. And for 20 mile an hour, 25 mile an hour, even though it gave an awful ride, that was okay.
Yeah, you could cope with it.
Yep. This is a highly refined racing car. This has got independent front suspension as well as it has independent rear suspension. It's got a transverse spring in the front. So, and then this is grease that goes into these sliding towers, and this goes up and down. So this tire stays straight up and down the entire time. And the amount of unsprung weight on this car is far less than the unsprung weight on that car.
Right.
Because on that one, the entire front end is moving back and forth and the springs and all.
Right.
But the front end in this car is hooked permanently to the frame.
Right. Wow, what a difference.
And the amount of mass, you have only 1 spring instead of effectively 4 springs like you have on that.
Right. Wow.
So you basically have one of these full elliptic springs going across the front of this car.
Except on this one, it's a semi-elliptic.
It's a semi-elliptic, but we're only using quarter-elliptic on each side.
That's right. So it's basically 2 quarters that just happen to be attached in the middle.
Yep,
that's
they
how
are
they're working.
So the amount of unsprung weight is, 15% as much on this. And that unsprung weight also adds to the jounce of something. And then because this sliding pillar goes up and down, so if I hit a bump on this tire, this suspension collapses that 4 inches or so and doesn't affect any part of the car. Where on this car, if you push any corner of it, it makes everything change.
Right.
This doesn't. I don't have an easy point to... Well, it moves nicely, but
Yeah, you don't really... These fenders aren't exactly made for jumping on.
yeah.
It's a racing fender.
So this, and then the way you add dampening to this, you put more grease into this, and the more grease and the thicker the grease, you can kind of control the jounce when you have very little of it to begin with.
Okay, and I'm thinking also about our story on seals. I'm sure the seals for this were quite a technology too, to keep the grease in.
Yeah, it's leather with a plate on the bottom and the top to keep the grease in there.
Okay.
And then going down the road, this just moves a little bit, with no extra jounce whatsoever.
Right.
It's just nice and pretty.
Well, for people that are feeling ripped off, they're not seeing this front suspension move, we will do some driving and show it.
The way you adjust these shocks is you turn this in so you're putting more friction on the friction materials on the inside. We'll talk about the materials used in a moment. But I just took this one off to show. Okay, I had these set for what I thought was good. I had it so I had no extra bounce after I pushed down and it came back up again. And then when I get them all, both of them done to kind of suit me, and I drive it for a while, and then I might adjust them again a little bit, pushing on each corner. I'll take them both off and see what they both measure. So the range of measuring for a shock like this is between 20 and 40 pounds of friction.
Yeah.
So the way you test it is you push a fishing scale or some kind of a scale, and then you operate it and see what your reading is.
Okay.
And if you have 20 pounds on one side when you get all done and 35 on the other side, you might, when you take them both off, you might adjust them both to 27 or 28 pounds so it's really uniform.
I see.
So we're going to show how you adjust this. So I'm going to open the scissor.
Okay.
So that's a consistent amount of weight. That was 20 pounds or 15 pounds or whatever that was. I wasn't looking.
Yep.
That's how you measure what you're adjusting. I'm going to now make the shock tighter. So now I've adjusted it so it's tighter.
Okay. Yep. Definitely shows up tighter on the scale. Yeah.
So that probably 50 pounds of weight on
Well,
it.
I think it went up to 40 is what we
Okay,
saw.
40 pounds.
Yeah.
So that's what you do by adjusting. You're adjusting the friction. So now we'll take it apart and show you what the materials are that are used.
Great. They're using metric back then.
Yeah. Well, this is metric shock. Okay, those are the pieces that make up your friction shock.
Okay.
So these discs this comes off too. It's stuck on there a little bit, but okay. These discs were sometimes oiled leather. Sometimes they were actually pieces of wood. Sometimes they were Bakelite. Sometimes they were lead. I've seen one case where it mentioned that they were made out of pure silver. A more common material was to have a fibrous material, like a wood, on one side, and maybe a brass lubricating material on the other. And why did they put two dissimilar metals on there, or two dissimilar pieces of material? Because they had stiction. So at some point in time, when you keep adjusting this shock, if you had two fibrous materials, you might have stiction, where you might have non-compliant suspension.
So like shutter or something.
Yeah, a little bit. So you might have one with wood, fibrous, and the other one might have with brass or bronze or copper. So the racers would change these discs so they got the same tightness with a better action. And there's even a company today that replaces one or both of these with a poly material, a modern plastic of some kind of material. So you can play around with these discs. That's why we're not going to show a drive with these today, because I'm not satisfied necessarily with the original fiber disc that this one already had. I'm going to play around. I'm going to machine some brass ones and different materials and see which ones I like.
Yeah. Excellent.
But that's what goes inside.
A little experimental. So now we see how they tick. Okay.
So you can see that on the center blade, this goes on both sides.
Right.
Slips inside of this.
It's kind of ingenious with the simplicity of it.
And so on. So these will last forever. These are original ones that I restored. You can see all the pits in them still. And I pressed in new polyurethane bushings. But these, even though they're 100 and some years old, they're still like new.
Yeah.
So these are good shocks. You don't need to get new ones every 3 or 4 years. You can use these for a few hundred years.
There you go. Okay, Alan. Well, this is a fantastic lesson in very early automotive racing suspensions. It's really cool. And I promise we'll come back and show some driving over bumps footage or something. We'll come up with something.
And if you could give us a big enough building and enough wood, we could make that ramp to do the loop-de-loop.
And then we can open our own circus show.
Right.
Very good. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Okay.